this is also a time of change for my family.
King Frederick had prepared himself for difficult decisions. In the 6 months since his mother's passing, he had signed treaties, opened parliament, and stood before a grieving nation without once losing his composure. But nothing had prepared him for the sealed decree placed before him on a quiet Tuesday morning. Written under the authority of the late Queen Margarethe, it carried one devastating instruction. His wife, Queen Consort Isabel, was to be denied permanent residence in every royal home controlled by the Crown of Oldenburg. As Frederick read the final line, his hands stopped moving. The private study fell silent except for the low tick of a long case clock that had stood in that room for 200 years. Outside the window, gardeners moved across the palace lawn as though nothing in the world had changed, unaware that inside, everything had. A royal secretary named Mr. Halloway stepped into the study, carrying a black dispatch box stamped with the late Queen's personal cipher, a mark reserved for instructions meant to survive her. He explained, in the careful tone of a man who had rehearsed his words, that the seal on the box could only be broken following a constitutional review, an examination of whether a sovereign's private instructions remained binding after death. The review had concluded that morning. The box was now, officially, Frederick's problem. He opened it not knowing that the next page would strike directly at his marriage. The decree named every residence under Crown control: Ashcombe Palace, Bray Hollow Castle, Thornfield House, and Glenmar Lodge, as permanently closed to Isabel as a place of residence. Crown control meant precisely what it sounded like. These houses belonged to the institution of the monarchy, not to whichever sovereign happened to occupy the throne, and certainly not to that sovereign's spouse. Frederick read the restriction twice. He removed his glasses and set them beside the page, the way he always did when a piece of correspondence required more from him than he had to give. His devastation came from more than the instruction itself. His mother had written this knowing, someday, her son would discover exactly how little his love could command against the weight of the institution she had spent 70 years protecting. Isabel was waiting nearby in the adjoining sitting room, expecting a conversation about the household budget for the coming year. Mundane, procedural, the kind of thing they discussed over morning coffee without much thought. When Frederick entered without the folder she expected, she looked up and understood, before he said a word, that something irreversible had happened. "What was decided?" she asked. He tried to answer. The words would not come. A handwritten clause at the bottom of the decree made its severity unmistakable. No sitting sovereign could overturn the instruction privately. Any challenge had to be brought before the Crown Council, a formal body convened to examine decisions touching royal authority, and whatever the council decided would enter the permanent constitutional record of Oldenburg, available to historians and successors for as long as the monarchy itself endured. Frederick asked who else had known. Halloway told him that Princess Rosalind, his elder sister, and Prince Edmund, his son and heir, had been named custodians of the decree, entrusted with protecting the document and ensuring its terms were carried out, whatever their personal feelings about them. Before Frederick could explain any of this to Isabel, Rosalind arrived at the study door and asked to see her brother alone. She was carrying a second sealed envelope, written in their mother's unmistakable hand, and Frederick understood in that moment that the decree had revealed only the surface of what their mother had left behind. The decree had not simply separated Isabel from a handful of houses. It had placed Frederick between the woman he loved and the family members sworn to protect his mother's final command. And for a king who had spent his entire adult life being told that duty and desire could coexist if he was careful enough, patient enough, disciplined enough, the decree was proof that he had been wrong. For Isabel, the wound cut differently. She could remain beside her husband in public, could attend every state dinner and Christmas broadcast and garden party for the rest of her life. But the late queen had made certain that the oldest walls of the monarchy would never fully recognize her as belonging within them. Frederick carried memories through every one of those corridors. Bray Hollow Castle held the weight of his childhood, his father's slow decline, the years when the idea of succession felt less like an inheritance and more like a debt he owed a country that had never asked his permission to love him. Glenmar Lodge held something quieter. family summers, long arguments settled over breakfast, the last conversations he'd had with his mother before her health began to fail in earnest. These were not simply grand houses. They were the architecture of his identity. Being told that his wife could never fully belong inside them felt, to Frederick, like a judgment written into the stone itself. Isabel understood, better than most, that her position had always rested on more than a title. Queen Consort was the wife of the reigning monarch, an honor, a role, a public duty, but it did not automatically confer ownership or permanent rights over property that belonged to the crown, rather than to the individual who happened to wear it. Her acceptance into royal life had come slowly, over almost 2 decades, built one public appearance and one private kindness at a time, protected always by Frederick's loyalty and reinforced, gradually, by an institution that had once viewed her with open suspicion. Now, with a single document written by a woman 3 months in her grave, that hard-won acceptance felt suddenly, terrifyingly conditional. Which houses? Isabel asked him in the private sitting room where they had spent almost every quiet evening of their marriage. Frederick could not answer immediately. He walked to the window, gathered himself, and named them slowly. Ashcombe, Bray Hollow, Thornfield, Glenmara. Each name landed like a separate loss. Isabel stood perfectly still, listening until the final residence had been spoken, and Frederick could see in her face that she had understood the truth of it before he'd finished explaining. This was not a temporary arrangement, subject to review or softened with time. It was a permanent boundary, drawn by a woman who was no longer alive to be argued with. Isabel did not cry. She reached into the small clutch bag she still carried out of habit even indoors, removed a single brass key, Ashcombe's private wing, the rooms that had been unofficially hers for 11 years, and set it on the table between them. Then she asked, in a voice so level it frightened him more than tears would have, whether the others would need to be surrendered before nightfall. The question broke something in Frederick because it was practical, restrained, far more painful than anger would have been. Rosalind viewed the decree differently than her brother did, and she made no apology for it. As Princess Royal, she had spent 4 decades watching the institution absorb one crisis after another. Divorces, scandals, disputed inheritances, and she believed, without reservation, that their mother's decree existed to protect crown property from exactly the kind of blurred loyalty that had caused half those earlier crises. In her mind, the order was not a punishment aimed at Isabel. It was a barrier against confusion, a line drawn now, cleanly, so that no future monarch's grief or gratitude or love could later be mistaken for a legal claim. Edmund felt no such certainty. In a quiet conversation with his wife, Princess Charlotte, late on the evening the decree became known within the family, he admitted that enforcing the document as written might destroy his father emotionally, might cost him a relationship with Frederick he wasn't sure could ever be repaired. And yet the prince also feared what it would mean to simply ignore his grandmother's final command, a fracture in the public's trust that the crown honored its own rules even when honoring them was painful, even when the person most affected by them was the reigning king. It was Charlotte who noticed the line their attention had skipped past, a brief handwritten note attached to the bottom of the decree, referring to the Bray Hollow conversation as the moment that had made the restriction necessary. To understand why Margarethe had taken such an extraordinary step, the family would eventually have to confront a private evening they had spent years quietly agreeing never to discuss. The decree had not been born from distant suspicion or vague institutional disapproval. It began during one evening at Bray Hollow Castle, nearly 3 years earlier, when an ordinary family conversation became, without anyone quite realizing it at the time, a point of no return. Only 4 people had been present. No official minutes were taken. The doors had remained closed. And yet by sunrise, Queen Margarethe had summoned her private secretary and begun drafting the order that would, one day, devastate her eldest son. She had invited Frederick, Isabel, and Rosalind into her private drawing room after a memorial service for a distant cousin, grief still hanging over the evening, none of them expecting a practical conversation to become a permanent fracture. Margarethe wanted clarity, she said, about what would happen to the royal residences after her death. Crown properties, she reminded them, were homes held in trust for the institution, not personal estates a monarch could freely will to espouse, however beloved. Isabel listened carefully, and then asked the question that changed the room. She wanted to know whether she would retain a permanent private suite at Bray Hollow and continued access to Glenmara if she outlived her husband. Margarethy's expression hardened at once. To her, the request did not sound like a woman seeking basic security. It sounded like a claim reaching beyond Frederick's lifetime and into the reign that would follow his, a reign that, by rights, belonged to Edmund and to the institution, not to any individual's personal comfort. Frederick moved quickly to defend his wife. He argued that denying her long-term protection would humiliate her publicly and reopen wounds the family had spent years working to close. He believed, in that moment and for a long time after, that he was defending dignity. Margarethy heard something else entirely, an attempt to convert personal suffering into permanent entitlement. Rosalind watched the argument deepen and later admitted she had entered the room expecting nothing more than a careful, if somber, family discussion. Instead, she watched her mother's tone shift, watched loyalty and property become tangled together in a way that could not easily be pulled apart again. Then came the moment that decided everything. Isabel produced a folded household memorandum, a formal proposal she had prepared, listing Bray Hollow, Glenmara, and 2 other residences for her continued personal use, regardless of what happened to Frederick. Margarethy read the page in silence, closed it without signing, and slid it back across the table. The Crown's homes, she said, could never become compensation for past suffering. The meeting ended without agreement. The damage, however, had already been done. That night, alone in her study, Margarethy called her private secretary and gave a documented instruction: prepare a binding decree, one that would survive her, blocking Isabel from permanent residency in every Crown-controlled property. Rosalind witnessed the order being given. Edmund was later named a future custodian, tasked with protecting the decree once his grandmother was no longer alive to enforce it herself. Now Rosalind held the second envelope, their mother's private explanation, addressed to Frederick alone. Whatever it contained could soften the wound, or it could prove that Bray Hollow had always been the point beyond which there was no returning. When Rosalind finally placed their mother's letter in front of Frederick, the buried argument became something no longer confined to memory. It became a confrontation between the living. Frederick dismissed every attendant from the room before Rosalind broke the seal. No courtiers remained to soften the language. No officials stood ready to redirect the conversation. No ceremonial formality protected either sibling from what came next. "Why did you guard this in silence?" Frederick demanded. Rosalind answered with equal force. She had not guarded it from him specifically. She had guarded their mother's final authority from everyone, including him, including herself, including the temptation to soften something that had never been meant to be soft. They sat opposite each other in a small private chamber, the decree between them, the letters still unopened. Rosalind explained that their mother had feared early disclosure would invite exactly the kind of pressure and private negotiation that might quietly unravel the order before it ever took effect. Margarethy had known her son would fight for Isabel. She had also known that love, mixed with the authority of a throne, could become nearly impossible to challenge once it had time to entrench itself. Frederick pushed his chair back and accused his sister of standing beside him at every ceremony, every anniversary, every public appearance for 3 years, all while knowing what waited for his marriage. He demanded to know how long she had intended to stay silent. Rosalind's voice tightened. She told him that loyalty to the crown did not mean disobeying a sovereign's final, documented wish. Then, for the first time, her composure slipped. She admitted that carrying their mother's secret had cost her years of closeness with her own brother, that every conversation between them since Bray Hollow had been shadowed by a truth she could not share. She opened the letter and read from it aloud. Margarethy had written that she never doubted her son's love for Isabel. What she feared was that devotion, left unchecked, would blur the line between the crown's inheritance and one woman's private future. Royal homes, she had written, could not be permitted to become proof of affection. Not because affection didn't matter, but because an institution built to outlast any single marriage could not be allowed to bend its foundations around one. And then came the deeper wound. Margarethe had expected Frederick to challenge the decree. She had specifically required Edmund's involvement as custodian because, in her judgment, only the future king could stop a grieving, reigning monarch from acting through emotion rather than duty. The decision had been designed not only to withstand Isabel's claim, but, if necessary, to withstand Frederick himself. Frederick rose and declared he would summon the Crown Council to seek reconsideration, a move that would force Edmund to choose, publicly and permanently, between his father and his grandmother's final command. The conflict had escaped the private study. The next decision would no longer belong to Frederick alone. Edmund entered the council chamber knowing that a single choice could define both his relationship with his father and the kind of king he would one day become. Frederick expected loyalty. Rosalind expected duty. Isabel expected mercy. And their late mother, in writing the decree as she had ensured that Edmund's consent was the hinge on which everything now turned, placing the future monarch at the exact center of a family wound that no title could shield him from. He paused outside the chamber, his grandmother's handwritten notes still folded in one hand. Charlotte found him there and understood immediately the weight he was carrying. The decree allowed Frederick to formally request reconsideration, but both custodians, Edmund and Rosalind, had to agree before the Crown Council could even debate a change. Rosalind had already made her position unmovable. That left the prince holding power neither he nor his father could pretend didn't matter. Charlotte asked him one quiet question. Was he deciding as a son or as an heir? Edmund looked down at the page and admitted, honestly, that he no longer knew where one duty ended and the other began. Frederick appealed to him the moment the chamber doors closed. He argued that the decree punished Isabel simply for surviving him, that it condemned his wife to become a royal widow without a royal home, stripped of every place where she had stood at his side for nearly 2 decades. His voice remained controlled, but his fear was unmistakable. He was not only defending Isabel's future. He was, whether he admitted it aloud or not, imagining his own absence and what it would mean to leave her exposed to it. Edmund did not answer with emotion. He opened the documented terms and pointed out, calmly, that Isabel would not be left without protection. She could retain any privately owned residences she and Frederick had acquired outside Crown control, and she would receive financial provisions, funds legally reserved for her security and living costs, entirely separate from the question of royal property. What she could not hold was permanent control over homes that belonged, by law and tradition, to the institution rather than to any individual family. Then Edmund disclosed a safeguard buried deeper in the order. If Frederick attempted to transfer any crown residence into private ownership on Isabel's behalf, government trustees would be required to automatically review the transaction, a mechanism ensuring no quiet workaround could defeat his grandmother's decree after the fact. Rosalind watched her nephew carefully, understanding that the decision had shifted from a matter of family loyalty into one of institutional survival. Frederick waited for the signature that would reopen the fight. Edmund refused to give it immediately. Instead, he asked for one final, private conversation with Isabel herself. Her answer, he said, would decide whether the family entered an open, public struggle over the decree, or found another way through it. For the first time, Isabel would have to speak for her own future without her husband in the room to speak for her. Palace officials could not simply wait for a family resolution. By late afternoon, household staff had received quiet instructions to begin suspending Isabel's residential privileges. The change was carried out without ceremony, which somehow made it feel more brutal, not less. A single leather case was placed on a table in front of her, and one by one, the keys to the royal residences were requested back. Isabel sat beside her private secretary as each item was logged. The decree still permitted her to attend official functions and stay temporarily beside Frederick when duty required it, but it removed her permanent rooms, her independent access, and her authority over household staff in those residences. She could still enter as the king's consort. She could no longer belong there on her own terms. Staff moved through her former suites at Bray Hollow, Ashcombe, Thornfield, and Glenmara, separating her personal belongings from pieces that were part of the official royal collection. The artworks, furniture, and historic objects held for the monarchy as an institution rather than owned by any individual family member. Every labeled crate carried an unspoken message. Some things could leave with her. Others would remain behind, untouched by memory or marriage. When Brayhallow's key was called, Isabel hesitated. That key had carried years of guarded acceptance, quiet summers, long walks, the slow-earned belief that she had finally crossed into a place once closed to her. She held it a moment longer than the others before setting it into the case without protest. Frederick entered before the inventory was finished. He ordered the officials out, and the room emptied at once. He looked at the case, then at his wife, and apologized. Isabel answered quietly that his apology could not change the most painful truth of the day. His mother had prepared for this long before either of them had known it was coming. Then came another blow. Isabel learned that several rooms she had believed were permanently hers had, in fact, never been formally assigned at all. Margaretti had kept them under a temporary household designation. Usable, but never legally claimed, meaning the late queen had been quietly enforcing the limits of the decree for years before it was ever revealed. She had not simply written a future restriction. She had been living it into existence in silence. A documented notice arrived from the council office shortly after. Frederick's emergency request could not proceed unless Edmund signed the authorization before midnight. Without it, the decree would become administratively permanent, closing off any immediate path to challenge it. Isabel did not ask her husband to fight harder. Instead, she requested a private meeting with Edmund before the deadline. Frederick stared at her, slowly realizing she had already reached a decision neither man had expected. There were no secretaries in the room, no legal advisors, no ceremonial protocol standing between them. Edmund and Isabel sat across from each other as two people bound by nearly 2 decades of shared history, not as prince and consort. He expected her to press for his signature. She expected him to defend his grandmother. Instead, the conversation moved somewhere neither of them had prepared for, and it changed the meaning of the entire decree. Isabel had chosen a modest private room at Fernbridge House rather than any of the palaces named in the decree. The choice mattered to her. She wanted no royal walls, no inherited authority, no household officials standing between them, only the chance to speak as a wife facing loss, rather than as a consort defending privilege. Edmund arrived carrying the unsigned authorization that could still reopen the entire dispute. He told her plainly that his father viewed refusal as a kind of betrayal, that Frederick believed a single signature could restore what felt, to him, like basic justice, and feared that withholding it would confirm the family had chosen a dead woman's command over a living man's marriage. Isabel did not defend herself right away. She admitted that surrendering the keys had felt like a final judgment on her entire life within the family, that every locked door seemed to whisper the same thing, that years of service, patience, and public acceptance had, in the end, remained conditional. She had stood beside Frederick through triumph and humiliation both. And yet the decree reduced her place within the dynasty to a kind of permission that could be withdrawn at will. Edmund listened without interrupting. He acknowledged, honestly, how cruel the order could feel from where she was sitting. But he also explained his own fear plainly. If he overturned his grandmother's final command, simply because his father loved his wife, that act would become a precedent. A decision future members of the family might one day use to justify placing private desire above the institution's foundations. He could not protect one marriage by quietly weakening every reign that came after it. And then Isabel surprised him. She asked him not to sign. She told him she would not allow Frederick to fracture his relationship with his own son, or weaken the monarchy itself, merely to prove the depth of his devotion to her. Instead, she offered a private compromise of her own design, a signed renunciation, a formal document in which she would voluntarily give up her claim entirely. She would live permanently at a private residence the couple already owned outright, use Fernbridge House only where legally permitted, surrender any future claim to crown property, continue her public duties exactly as before, and never challenge questions of ownership.